The morning dawned with a faint chill in the air, the kind that hinted at the changing seasons. James Reynolds tugged his weathered jacket tighter around his frame as he climbed into the driver's seat of the city bus. The number 17 route was a part of his life, as familiar as the rising sun. For 10 years he had crisscrossed the same streets, greeted the same morning faces, and navigated the ebb and flow of the city's energy. At 42, James lived a life that was simple but stretched thin. His 2-room apartment, shared with his 14-year-old daughter Emily, was a world he cherished. After losing his wife to illness when Emily was just a toddler, James had learned to make the most of what little they had. Bills stacked up. Repairs to their leaky ceiling always seemed out of reach, and his second-hand car had long since given up the ghost. But every morning he reminded himself that they had each other, and for James that was enough to keep going. As the bus sputtered to life, James adjusted the mirror and took his first sip of coffee, the rich aroma blending with the faint scent of the rain-soaked pavement outside. His regulars began boarding Mrs. Doyle with her paper shopping bag, always off to the market, a young mother with twin boys who tumbled onto the bus like miniature whirlwinds, and a few suited workers scrolling through their phones. "Morning, James," Mrs. Doyle said with a cheery wave. "Morning, Mrs. Doyle," James replied with a smile. "Got the rain on your heels today?" "Don't I always," she quipped, shaking droplets from her umbrella as she found her seat. The bus rolled forward, and James settled into his familiar rhythm, glancing at the rearview mirror to ensure everyone was seated before turning onto the main avenue. At the third stop, James noticed a figure waiting near the curb, hunched against the drizzle. The man wore a threadbare tweed coat that had seen better days and carried a scuffed leather wallet that he clutched tightly in his weathered hands. As James opened the door, the man hesitated before climbing the steps. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, and James could see the years etched into his lined face and bent shoulders. "Take your time, sir," James said gently, offering the man a nod of encouragement. The man reached the top step and paused, looking at the fare box as he rummaged through his wallet. His hands trembled slightly as he searched its nearly empty compartments. His expression faltered, a mix of frustration and shame crossing his features. I'm afraid I don't have enough for the fare," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I had more." The bus was silent for a moment. James could feel the man's embarrassment radiating through the space, a heavy weight that settled in the air. Behind him, a few passengers shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. James reached into his own pocket without hesitation, pulling out a handful of coins. "Don't worry about it," he said with a reassuring smile, slipping the coins into the fare box. "You're all set. Go ahead and grab a seat." The man looked up, his eyes glassy with emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You didn't have to." "Hey, it's just a bus fare," James replied, waving off the man's gratitude. "We've all been there. You take care of yourself, all right?" The man nodded, his pride visibly battling with his relief. "I won't forget this," he murmured as he shuffled toward an empty seat. As the bus rumbled forward, James glanced at the man in the mirror. He sat quietly, his tweed coat pulled tightly around him, staring out the window as if trying to absorb the world outside. Later that evening, James returned to his modest apartment, shaking the rain off his jacket as Emily greeted him with her usual burst of energy. "Hey, Dad," she called from the kitchen, where the smell of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air. "How was work?" James leaned against the doorway, watching his daughter with a mix of pride and gratitude. She was his anchor, her bright smile a constant reminder of why he worked so hard. "Same as always," James said with a shrug. "Though I did help an older gentleman pay for his fare today. Poor guy looked like he'd been through a lot." Emily turned, her hands dusted with flour. "That was really nice of you, Dad." James smiled. "Maybe. I figured it was just the right thing to do. No one deserves to feel stranded." Emily nodded thoughtfully, her expression serious despite the streak of flour on her cheek. You know, Mom used to say kindness always comes back around. Maybe it'll come back to you too. James chuckled, pulling a cookie from the tray. Maybe, he said, though he didn't expect anything in return. For him, the act of helping someone who needed it was enough. As the days turned into weeks, James nearly forgot about the encounter. The man didn't board the bus again, and life carried on as usual. Bills loomed, repairs on the apartment remained unfinished, and every payday felt like a quick breath before the tide rose again. But even as James carried the weight of his daily struggles, the memory of that moment stayed with him. He had seen something in the man's eyes, a mix of gratitude and dignity restored, that reminded him why he held on to hope. What James couldn't have known was that his small act of kindness had set something remarkable in motion, far beyond the walls of his apartment, or the familiar streets of his bus route. And soon his life would change in ways he never imagined. Life carried on as usual for James after the encounter with the elderly passenger. His days followed the same steady rhythm: early mornings on the bus, hours navigating the city streets, and quiet evenings with Emily in their small but welcoming apartment. Yet, even as the routine kept moving, James couldn't help but reflect on the encounter. The memory of the man's trembling hands and relieved smile stayed with him, a quiet reminder of how small gestures could carry great weight. Still, James didn't dwell on it. Kindness, he believed, was meant to be given without strings or expectations. But life has a way of interrupting even the most predictable routines. It was a drizzly Tuesday afternoon when James's day took an unexpected turn. His shift had ended, and he was enjoying a rare moment of peace in the depot break room, sipping lukewarm coffee while the rain drummed steadily against the windows. "Mr. Reynolds." The voice startled James, and he looked up to see a sharply dressed man standing in the doorway. The man was in his early 60s, with a neatly trimmed silver beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room in a single glance. He carried a sleek black umbrella in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. "Yes, that's me," James said, setting his coffee aside. "Can I help you?" The man stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. "My name is Arthur Duncan," he said, extending his hand. "I believe you helped my father, George Duncan, a few weeks ago." James stood, shaking Arthur's hand with a mix of confusion and curiosity. "Oh, you mean the bus fare? That was nothing, really. Just helping someone out." Arthur's expression softened, and for a moment, James thought he saw something vulnerable in the man's otherwise confident demeanor. "It may have been nothing to you, but to my father it meant everything. My mother passed away last year, and my father has been struggling ever since. He doesn't talk about it much, but I know how hard it's been for him. Your kindness that day, well, it gave him hope at a time when he needed it most." James shifted uncomfortably, not used to receiving such heartfelt gratitude. "I'm glad I could help," he said, his voice humble. "But honestly, it was just a few coins. Anyone would have done the same." Arthur shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. Not everyone would have done what you did, and my father recognized that. He's been talking about you ever since, and he wanted to find a way to thank you." Before James could protest, Arthur set his briefcase down on a nearby table and opened it, pulling out an envelope. He handed it to James with a resolute look. "What's this?" James asked, taking the envelope hesitantly. "Open it," Arthur urged, stepping back slightly to give James space. James tore the envelope open, his heart pounding as he pulled out a folded sheet of paper. A check fluttered out and landed on the table. James stared at the figure written on it, his breath catching in his throat. "It's $10,000. This can't be real," James stammered, his hands trembling. "It's very real," Arthur said with a small smile. "My father insisted on this. He knows you're a hard-working man with responsibilities, and he wanted to repay your kindness in the only way he could." James shook his head, overwhelmed. "I can't accept this, it's too much. I was just doing my job." You weren't just doing your job, Arthur said firmly. You went above and beyond when you didn't have to. My father believes in paying kindness forward, and so do I. Please take it. Consider it not as charity, but as gratitude. James stood there in stunned silence, the check heavy in his hand. For a man who lived paycheck to paycheck, this was more than money. It was a lifeline, a chance to catch up on overdue bills, repair the leaking ceiling, and give Emily the things she often went without. Finally, James looked up, his eyes glistening. Please thank your father for me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This will make a world of difference for my daughter and me. Arthur smiled, relief softening his sharp features. I will. And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. As Arthur left, James sat back down, the check still clutched in his hand. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. That evening, James placed the check on the kitchen table, unable to wait to share the news with Emily. Her eyes widened as she stared at the piece of paper, her expression a mixture of disbelief and wonder. Dad, are you serious? This is real, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's real, James said with a laugh, though he still felt a twinge of disbelief himself. And it's all because of a little kindness. Emily threw her arms around him, her embrace tight and full of joy. You deserve this, Dad. You're always helping other people. It's about time someone helped you. They spent the rest of the evening talking about what they would do with the money, catching up on bills, setting aside savings, and maybe even taking a weekend trip to the beach, something they'd only dreamed of before. But as James lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts kept returning to George Duncan. The man's gesture was more than generosity. It was a reminder of the connections we forged through small, selfless acts and the way kindness could ripple outward in unexpected ways. James knew he had to thank George in person. Not just for the money, but for showing him that compassion was a force greater than any one moment. And this, he realized, was only the beginning. James couldn't shake the thought of George Duncan. The check had been a blessing beyond what he could have imagined. But what lingered most in his mind wasn't the money, it was the man behind the gesture. The older gentleman's quiet dignity and his son's heartfelt explanation stayed with James like a warm ember, glowing faintly through the routines of his days. After much consideration, James decided he needed to meet George again, not just to thank him, but to understand the man who had touched his life so profoundly. With Arthur's contact information saved from their last meeting, James placed a call and was relieved when Arthur answered promptly. James, Arthur said warmly. How's everything going? It's going well, James replied. Thanks to you and your father, I've been able to catch up on bills and make some repairs to our home. But that's why I'm calling. I was wondering if it might be possible to meet your father in person. I'd really like to thank him. Arthur didn't hesitate. I'm sure he'd love that. He's been asking about you too. How about a coffee at his favorite cafe tomorrow afternoon? The next day, James arrived early at the cafe, a cozy corner spot with wooden tables and warm light spilling through the windows. He ordered a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the rain-speckled world outside. When the door swung open, James recognized George instantly. The older man shuffled in slowly, his familiar tweed coat buttoned tightly against the chill. James stood, and George's face lit up with a smile when he saw him. Mr. Duncan, James said, extending a hand. Call me George, the older man replied, gripping James's hand firmly. It's good to see you again. The two men sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. James finally broke the silence, his voice steady but full of emotion. First, I need to thank you properly. The check. It's changed everything for me and Emily. But more than that, your gesture reminded me of something I'd started to forget, that there's still goodness in the world. George smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. James, you don't owe me any thanks. If anything, I owe you. That day on the bus, I was at one of the lowest points of my life. losing my wife, facing financial challenges. I felt like the world had moved on without me. His voice faltered for a moment before he continued, "You saw me. And you helped, without hesitation." James nodded, his throat tight. It just felt like the right thing to do. "And that," George said, pointing a finger for emphasis, "is exactly why I wanted to help you. You didn't do it for recognition or reward. You did it because you have a good heart. That kind of kindness deserves to be repaid in kind." The two men talked for over an hour, sharing stories that wove through the fabric of their lives. George spoke of his late wife, Helen, and the many ways she had taught him the value of generosity. "She used to say kindness is like planting seeds," George said, his voice soft but steady. "You don't always see the flowers bloom, but you trust that they will. You're one of those blooms, James. Helen would have loved to meet you." James, humbled by George's words, opened up about his own life, his struggles as a single father, his pride in Emily, and the challenges of keeping their small world afloat. "You've done right by your daughter," George said with conviction. "She's lucky to have a father like you. And now that I know your story, I'd like to do one more thing." James frowned slightly. "George, you've already done so much." "Let me finish," George interrupted with a chuckle. He pulled a small envelope from his pocket and slid it across the table. "What's this?" James asked, eyeing the envelope warily. "Open it," George urged. Inside, James found 2 tickets to a local theater production. He looked up, confused. "My wife and I used to go to the theater all the time," George explained. "It was our way of escaping the world for a few hours. I thought you and Emily might enjoy the same experience. It's nothing grand, but I think it'll be special." James smiled, deeply touched. "Thank you, George. She'll love this. She's always wanted to see a play." George's expression softened. "I'm glad. It's a small thing, but sometimes it's those small things that make the biggest difference." As they parted ways outside the cafe, James felt lighter than he had in years. Meeting George had affirmed his belief in the power of human connection, the way a simple gesture could create ripples far beyond what anyone imagined. That evening, as he showed Emily the tickets, her eyes lit up. "A play?" "Really?" she exclaimed, bouncing with excitement. "You mean it, Dad?" "I mean it," James said, his heart full as he watched her joy. And as they planned their outing together, James realized something profound. The kindness he had shown George had already come full circle. But it wasn't about the money or the theater tickets. It was about the reminder that they were all connected, and that one small act could plant seeds of change for years to come. The theater outing was everything James and Emily had hoped for and more. The grand building, with its glittering chandeliers and crimson velvet curtains, made Emily feel like she'd stepped into another world. James couldn't stop smiling as he watched her eyes widen at the sights and sounds, her laughter bubbling over at the comedic moments in the play. Afterward, as they walked home beneath a clear, star-studded sky, Emily turned to James. "Dad," she said, clutching the program from the play tightly, "can we do something like that for someone else? You know, make them feel happy, like Mr. Duncan made us feel." James stopped walking, surprised by her question. Her words reminded him of George's comment about kindness planting seeds. Perhaps Emily was a bloom he hadn't even realized he was nurturing. "I think we can," James said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "What do you have in mind?" Emily thought for a moment. "Well, there's a kid in my class, Devin. He never has lunch at school, and I heard him say his mom's been sick. Maybe we can help him." James nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "That's a great idea, Emily. We'll start there." The next day, after work, James stopped by the grocery store and picked up a week's worth of non-perishable snacks and packed lunches. He and Emily spent the evening decorating the bags with little notes of encouragement. "You're awesome. And keep smiling." The following morning, Emily handed Devin the bag during recess. At first, the boy hesitated, his face flushing with embarrassment. But Emily's smile was genuine, and her tone was kind. "It's just some extra stuff we had," she said cheerfully. "You don't have to say yes, but it's yours if you want it." Devin took the bag, his eyes wide and disbelieving. "Thanks," he mumbled before running off, clutching it tightly. When Emily told James about the exchange later, her excitement was contagious. He smiled, Dad. He really smiled. It felt amazing. James nodded. "That's what kindness does, Em. It makes the world feel just a little brighter." Over the next few weeks, James found himself seeking out more ways to pay George's generosity forward. At work, he volunteered to cover shifts for coworkers who needed time off. On weekends, he and Emily helped out at the local food pantry, organizing shelves and serving meals. The small moments of connection were humbling and fulfilling. James met people who reminded him of himself, parents juggling too many responsibilities, elderly folks who felt forgotten, and young kids who deserved brighter futures. And yet, with every act of kindness, James felt his own burdens lighten. One chilly evening, James's bus pulled into its final stop, and he noticed a man sitting on a bench near the depot entrance. The man's threadbare coat and weary posture reminded James of George the day they first met. James approached him cautiously. "Hey there," he said gently. "Waiting for a ride?" The man looked up, startled. "Just catching my breath," he replied. His voice was hoarse, and his hands trembled as he sipped from a steaming paper cup. A cardboard sign lay at his feet, "Anything helps." James hesitated for only a moment before pulling out the last $20 from his wallet. "Here," he said, kneeling to hand it to the man. "I hope this helps a little." The man blinked, as if unsure whether to accept, but eventually, he took the money with a grateful nod. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. James smiled, the words ringing familiar. "Just paying it forward," he replied. That night, Emily listened intently as James told her about the man at the depot. She thought for a moment, then said, "It's like Mr. Duncan said. Kindness is like planting seeds, right?" James nodded, a warmth spreading through him. "Exactly. And it keeps growing, Em. That's the beauty of it." Their acts of kindness, small and big, were beginning to spread. Devin's mother stopped James at the grocery store one afternoon to thank him for helping her son. A coworker, inspired by James's efforts, started a donation drive at the depot for local families. The world around James seemed a little brighter, a little softer, and he realized that George's gesture had been far more than a gift. It was a spark, and now James was carrying the flame. Months had passed since James's life took its unexpected turn. The ripple effects of George Duncan's kindness had spread far and wide. The small acts of generosity James and Emily had started were now blooming into something far greater. At Emily's school, her kindness campaign was gaining momentum, with students writing notes of appreciation for cafeteria workers, janitors, and teachers. At the bus depot, James's co-workers had organized a monthly collection for struggling families, inspired by his example. And then there was James's proudest accomplishment, kindness rides, partnering with the local nonprofit Bridges of Kindness founded by George's son Arthur. James helped establish a program providing free transportation for seniors, veterans, and low-income families. Every Saturday, he drove a special route, connecting people to grocery stores, medical appointments, and community centers. Each passenger reminded him why the work mattered. One chilly Saturday morning, as James approached the final stop on his route, he noticed a familiar figure waiting at the curb. George Duncan, bundled in his signature tweed coat, waved as the bus pulled up. James opened the door with a grin. "George, what brings you here?" George climbed aboard slowly, his movements deliberate but steady. "I thought it was about time I saw this Kindness Rides program in action," he said, his voice warm. James chuckled as George settled into a seat near the front. "It's not much. but it's making a difference. Thanks to you." George shook his head, his smile wistful. "No, James. This isn't because of me. It's because of you. You took a simple gesture, a bus fare, and turned it into something extraordinary." As the bus rolled through the city, they talked about the impact the program was having. James shared stories of passengers who'd written letters of thanks, of children excited to visit their grandparents, and of seniors finally able to attend community events. George listened intently, his eyes glistening. "Helen would have loved this," he said softly. James glanced at him, waiting for George to continue. "She used to say kindness has a way of traveling farther than we can imagine," George said, his voice tinged with fondness. "When I met you that day, I didn't realize I'd be seeing her wisdom play out so clearly. You've made me proud, James." James was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of George's words settle over him. "You've taught me more than you know," he said finally. "Not just about kindness, but about what it means to believe in people." Later that evening, James and Emily hosted a small gathering at their apartment to celebrate the success of kindness rides. George and Arthur were there, along with some of the program's early supporters. Emily had baked cookies, and the room buzzed with laughter and conversation as everyone shared stories of how their lives had been touched by the initiative. As the evening wound down, George stood to address the group. "I'd like to say a few words," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "What we've done here, it's not about any one person. It's about all of us choosing to see each other, to lift each other up. James reminded me of that when he gave me a hand that day on the bus. And now, look how far that simple moment has taken us." The room erupted in applause, and James felt a swell of gratitude and pride. A few weeks later, on a quiet afternoon, James found himself driving his usual weekday route. The bus was mostly empty, and the sky outside was a brilliant shade of blue. As he approached a stop, he noticed an elderly man waiting with a cane and a small grocery bag. James opened the door and smiled. "Good afternoon, sir. Take your time." The man climbed aboard slowly and began fumbling for his wallet. I don't think I have enough for the fare," he said, his voice tinged with embarrassment. James felt a familiar pang of empathy. Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and paid the fare. "Don't worry about it," he said with a reassuring smile. "You're all set." The man looked up, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." James shook his head, his voice steady and kind. "Sometimes a little kindness goes a long way." As the bus rumbled forward, James felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing the circle of kindness would continue. Just as George Duncan's wife had said, the seeds had been planted, and the blooms were endless. James glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the elderly man settle into his seat. The city unfolded before him, vibrant and alive, and James realized he'd found something far more valuable than financial security or recognition. He'd found purpose, rooted in the simple but profound act of seeing others, of lifting them up, and of knowing that kindness, once planted, never stopped growing. And as the bus carried him into the heart of the city, James carried that purpose with him, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be.